Residential basements have long served as the cultural hub for unexplained phenomena. They are the dark, isolated endpoints where logic gives way to anxiety. Popular paranormal narratives thrives by committing a basic analytical error, accepting anomalous data at face value. A knocking sound becomes an entity. A visual artifact becomes an apparition. The narrative stops precisely where an actual forensic investigation should begin. To understand the dark, we examine this 3D wireframe model. We will analyze 3 case studies. First, acoustic and physical trace anomalies in the plumbing. Next, structural anomalies hidden in historical architecture. And finally, digital sensor failures caused by hardware limitations. When we subject these localized mysteries to the laws of physics, structural engineering, and optoelectronics, the evidence rapidly devolves. These events emerge from predictable mechanical failure modes. Consider our first case study. A resident moves into a 90-year-old house and begins hearing 3 slow, distinct knocks echoing from the basement, precisely at 2 a.m. The resident investigates the space with a flashlight. They find no visible signs of rats, no cracked pipes, and a completely empty room. The knocking immediately stops upon their arrival. This diagram illustrates a well-documented fluid dynamics principle known as hydraulic shock, or the water hammer effect. When water flow is suddenly halted or subjected to a pressure differential, a shock wave travels through the aging plumbing, causing the physical pipe to strike the wooden floor joists. Look at this overlaid time graph mapping municipal water pressure. Utilities routinely flush systems or adjust reservoir distribution late at night to accommodate low usage. A scheduled municipal pressure spike at 2 a.m. sends a surge through the neighborhood mains, triggering exact, rhythmic percussive knocks in the weakest points of aging domestic plumbing. The mechanical noise explains the knocking, but the resident also reported hearing a whispered voice say, "Don't leave," while standing in the empty basement. This introduces auditory pareidolia. The human brain is an active pattern recognition engine. When presented with ambiguous or chaotic sensory data, it automatically forces a recognizable linguistic pattern onto random white noise. Old basements are acoustic echo chambers. The combination of damp air density, vibrating pipes, and the 60 Hz hum of flickering electrical circuits generates a specific low-frequency drone. Standing alone in a tense environment, the resident's brain processed this ambient mechanical drone and mapped speech onto it. Auditory anomalies in aging structures result from plumbing hydraulics interacting with flawed biological sensors, specifically human hearing. The resident also presented physical evidence: muddy footprints leading up from the basement stairs that ended abruptly halfway across the kitchen floor. The immediate assumption is a violation of physical space, the idea that whatever tracked the mud either levitated or vanished entirely mid-stride. Physical forensics relies on the principle of substrate transition. This friction and desiccation chart tracks a muddy shoe tread moving from the porous, damp concrete of a basement onto a polished indoor surface like kitchen tile. When mud transfers onto a warm, non-porous surface, it rapidly desiccates. It loses moisture and structural adhesion exponentially with each footfall. The volume of transferred material depletes until the remaining mud stops sticking to the floor. The person, likely a previous occupant or worker, continued walking. Standard gate mechanics disperse the remaining microscopic dust into the ambient air currents of the room, leaving zero trace visible to the naked eye. Physical traces ending abruptly indicate a sudden change in friction and material adhesion. The transfer medium exhausted itself through standard locomotion. Our second case involves a tenant renting an old farmhouse. After a heavy basement shelf collapses, she discovers a small hidden wooden door concealed behind the wreckage. Inside is a narrow void containing a tiny, seemingly self-moving rocking chair, with walls covered in faded children's drawings. To understand this layout, we examine this architectural blueprint of a standard 19th century farmhouse. Homes of this era required localized utility voids. Sub-level cavities were intentionally constructed for coal chutes, cold storage, and root cellars. As refrigeration and modern heating emerged, these utility spaces became obsolete. Rather than executing costly demolition and structural fill, mid-century contractors frequently built secondary walls directly over the voids, covering them entirely with drywall and cheap utility shelving. When the tenant reported the discovery, the landlord arrived, appeared terrified, and immediately nailed the door shut without explanation. The landlord's reaction was entirely rational. A load-bearing shelf collapsing into a concealed architectural void implies severe foundation degradation and immediate structural liability. Nailing the door shut is a crude, panicked legal measure to prevent a tenant from trespassing into a physically hazardous zone. The tenant later learned a family whose daughter disappeared lived in the farmhouse. She connected this tragedy to one of the hidden drawings, dated 1984. This is a textbook example of retroactive continuity bias. Amateur investigators possess an overwhelming drive to synthesize data. When presented with two completely unconnected artifacts, a mundane drawing left in a coal chute by a previous tenant's child, and public records of a missing person, they retroactively merge them into a single, cohesive horror story. A hidden room and a historical tragedy existing of the same geographic coordinates proves the building is old. It does not establish supernatural causation. The third case introduces digital evidence. A homeowner reviews their security footage and sees a tall, faceless shadow with no reflection standing in the dark at 3:13 a.m. We inherently trust digital cameras as objective, unbiased observers. This misplaced trust masks the mechanical flaws happening inside the lens. This simulation shows a consumer-grade CMOS camera sensor attempting to operate in a zero-light environment. To record an image, the pixel grid must gather photons. In the dark, there are almost none available. To compensate, cheap security cameras emit their own light using basic infrared blasters. But these IR components possess an incredibly short, highly concentrated focal range. This creates IR reflection drop-off. Notice this 3D light cone projecting from the lens. Anything inside the cone reflects IR light back to the sensor perfectly. But if an object, like a person or a piece of hanging fabric, stands just a few inches outside that immediate focal range, it absorbs the weak ambient light rather than reflecting it. The sensor processes this lack of reflected photons as a dense block of black pixels. A physical object standing precisely inside the IR drop-off zone produces this specific silhouette. Digital anomalies captured in the dark demonstrate hardware limitations failing to process physical reality. The final moments of the footage are the most alarming. The video fills with static, the physical camera lens pans toward the stairs, and the original recording deletes itself from the local hard drive. This line graph maps variable bitrate encoding. Security cameras compress data to save local storage space, recording at a very low bitrate when the room is still. If something large suddenly moves, like a homeowner checking the basement, the camera is forced to write a massive amount of visual data simultaneously. The cheap local storage hits a processing bottleneck, drops the frames, and produces a corrupted file. The system either manifests this corruption as visual static or automatically deletes the broken file to prevent drive failure. That leaves the physical manipulation of the camera lens, which requires no supernatural explanation. Consumer Wi-Fi cameras are notoriously vulnerable Internet of Things devices. Users rarely change the default factory passwords. Automated scripts constantly scan external networks, allowing malicious actors from anywhere on the globe to log in, view the feed, and remotely trigger the pan and tilt motors. A digital haunting is almost universally the result of low-budget data processing combined with disastrous cybersecurity hygiene. Basements are low-information environments. Their architecture isolates us, depriving our biological and digital sensors of the light and spatial context required to parse reality. But when we map hydraulic wave data onto the physical plumbing, when we project historical vernacular blueprints over hidden cavities in the drywall, And when we define the exact focal drop-off of an optoelectronic sensor, the basement becomes a fully quantified mechanical system. The label Unexplained serves as a placeholder for those who have stopped examining the evidence. Rigorous analysis requires us to test our flawed biological perception and consumer electronics against the strict laws of physics before we abandon reason. True intellectual rigor means seeking the most mechanically sound explanation first. In the dark, reality is always stranger and more logical than fiction.